Hi, I'm Dr. Michael Berry. I'm a registered psychologist and the clinical director of HBR, and I'd like to talk to you today about motivation. Motivation is one of the most important areas of psychology research, and for the past 30 or 40 years or so, psychologists have put a lot of effort into answering questions like, why do we do what we do? What makes us work hard? And when we get stuck, what is it that holds us back? Nowadays, the field of psychology has a pretty good understanding of human motivation, and I'm going to share some of that research with you. But before we delve into it, let's stop and take a minute to reflect on those questions about motivation as they pertain to your life. What makes you work hard when you're working towards your important goals, and especially when you're working towards recovery? What makes you put in the effort? What makes you try your hardest to move forward? And conversely, when you get stuck, what are some of the things that hold you back and take away your motivation? For most people, success is a really big motivator, while setbacks tend to stunt their motivation. Success creates confidence, but disappointments often make us feel anxious and insecure, and they hinder us from staying motivated. Basically, they make us believe that we can't do it. And for a long time, I've said, we really only try things if we think we actually have a chance of being successful. And to be honest, that's a pretty rational perspective. After all, why would you try to do something if you really thought it was impossible? So, a necessary first step in recovery is to realize that recovery itself is possible. I'm sure you've heard this before. I mean, it's pretty well a cliche in the recovery world. And at this point, I can imagine that maybe you're doubtful. But honestly, I pay my mortgage based on the fact that recovery is possible with the right support and the right strategies. And let me be clear about this. If you're going to overcome your addiction, you absolutely have to embrace the belief that recovery is possible. And this isn't some feel-good thing. It's to create a sense of reasonable optimism and confidence, which allows you to increase your motivational drive. It kind of comes back to an old quote that's often attributed to Henry Ford. Whether you think you can, or whether you think you can't, you're right. When psychologists talk about motivation, they have to consider the role of emotions. As a clinical psychologist, I've discovered that people often think that they can use negative emotions like shame and guilt as effective sources of motivation. In working with these types of feelings, I often ask my clients, why don't you let go of your guilt? Why don't you let go of your shame? More often than not, they reply that they don't want to let themselves off the hook. That if they set aside their feelings of guilt, then it's like they're giving themselves permission to drink or use or, engage in other forms of unhealthy behavior. My response to them is usually to say, that's interesting because it seems like you feel pretty guilty and pretty ashamed right now, but somehow you seem to keep relapsing anyways. Is it possible that you'd be more successful if you treated yourself with a little more compassion and a bit more forgiveness? The reality and the science on human motivation that we're talking about here is that humans respond a lot better to the carrot than they do to the stick. And yet, somehow, a lot of addicts still keep trying to use that stick. So let's take another minute to reflect. What would change for you if you found a way to let go of guilt and shame? What would change for you if you rewarded yourself for your successes rather than punishing yourself for your failures? So let's talk about carrots and sticks for a few minutes. In this system, of course, the carrot is a reward and the stick is a punishment. As I said before, people are much more powerfully motivated by reward than they tend to be by punishment. And we are much better at moving towards something that we want based on a sense of excitement or enthusiasm for a possible reward instead of fear or anxiety about a negative outcome. There's a great book on goal motivation that helps illustrate these ideas. It's called Succeed, and it was written by a psychologist named Dr. Heidi Halvorson. It's absolutely on my top 5 list. Halvorson describes different approaches to motivation and goal setting, and one of her ideas is about the difference between adopting what she calls a promotion focus versus a prevention focus when you're in pursuit of a goal. Promotion focus involves doing things that will get you closer to your goal and rewarding yourself when you're on the right track. On the other side of the coin, prevention focus is about avoiding negative behaviors and punishing yourself if you engage in these negative behaviors. Basically, promotion focus involves looking at the carrot, and prevention focus involves thinking about the stick. Having promotion focus is more concerned with maximizing gains and approaching the problem, in this case, fighting addiction, head on. It's about who you'd ideally want to be. By contrast, prevention focuses on minimizing losses, staying safe, and avoiding mistakes. It's about who you think you should be. So let's apply these two approaches with a recovery example with a hypothetical client. David is an addict who is struggling in his recovery. He thinks that by guilting and shaming himself into giving up his addiction, he'll get the results he wants. He harbors a whole bunch of negative emotions about himself, so much so that he actually engages in his addictive behaviors to ease the pain that he's experiencing. Once he finishes his binge, he feels even more guilt about what he's done and continues to shame himself, thinking, this time it'll stick. He's trying to force himself to be a version of himself that he thinks he should be. He's trying to use a prevention-focused mindset, and he's caught. He's caught in a loop of guilt, shame, and addictive behavior. So reset. Same scenario, but this time David decides to seek help, starts attending a recovery group. And at the group, he's listening to people's success stories about battling their addictions and finding a way to maintain abstinence. David gets motivated by this. He realizes that, hey, maybe I too can achieve success. He's begun to see that recovery is possible, and he starts to motivate himself to maintain his abstinence by remembering that others have made it out of their addictions, and so can he. He begins to experience and see the good things that come out of recovery firsthand, like better connections with family, increased success at work, and improved connection and enjoyment in life. David starts to feel proud of his progress and uses that as fuel to keep himself on track. And despite having some setbacks along the way, he remembers that he's trying to work towards being the version of himself that he wants to be. And this will take some time, and it will include some mistakes. The prevention and promotion focus model also ties in with another really useful concept: the difference between aiming to be good versus focusing on getting better. Rather than focusing on being good, we should all try to put our attention towards the idea of getting better. This has to do with the type of goal that you set for yourself. You might have a performance goal, which relates to the desire of being good and showing off how smart, capable, or talented you are in the eyes of others. This is the kind of goal where you are actually doing it more for others than you actually are for yourself. It's often a little bit ego-driven. Alternatively, you could have what's called a mastery goal, which is about your desire to get better and develop or enhance your skills and abilities. When you look at yourself in terms of progress as opposed to results, this is the kind of motivational tool that you're using. The way you deal with setbacks will also vary depending on what sort of goal you set for yourself. Someone with a performance-oriented goal tends to internalize a setback, blaming themselves and potentially relapsing because they feel they aren't good enough to achieve their goal of abstinence. On the other hand, someone with a mastery goal will look at the same failure as a sign that they simply haven't mastered that goal yet. For someone with a mastery mindset, slips and relapses can actually become motivating experiences that help them work harder to achieve their goal. I think it's important to remember that your reality depends on how you interpret it, and the same events can have totally different meanings or outcomes depending on the context you provide. So I'd like to take a moment to encourage you to think about how you see your goal-setting tendencies. What kind of goal-setting and motivating tendencies do you recognize in yourself? Do you tend to focus more on being good or on getting better? What do you think might change in your life if you adopted the mastery mindset, which focuses mainly on getting better? Now, personally, I like examples that involve money. Money is one of the clearest and most definite motivators for human behavior, and it can help illustrate why we do the things we do and how we do things if there was a lot on the line. I often like to ask clients questions about what they would do for money to illustrate how they could enhance and increase their motivation and their drive. So let me ask you this. If someone was going to give you $1 million in 1 year's time, but you have to stay completely clean and abstinent from all addictive behaviors for that whole year, would you try? Do you think you could do it? I think that most people would make it happen. They'd do absolutely anything and everything they could for such a big carrot. And assuming that you are one of those people, I've got to ask, what would you do to keep yourself abstinent from addiction for that year if there was $1 million on the line? Before we move on, one more reflection question. What do you have on the line with your addiction? Your relationships? Your health? Your future? Aren't all these things worth at least $1 million? So whether it's a bunch of money or simply the knowledge that your recovery is worth at least as much, I suspect that if you had a good vision of the carrot, you'd go to any length necessary. You'd likely stay away from bars and parties, cut out toxic relationships, use healthy coping and distractions, set boundaries with people who enable your addiction, whatever you need to do. These are useful things, and I want you to think about how exactly you'd implement these behaviors. A lot of the time, the answer may seem simple. Just stop engaging in your addiction. But in order to really make that happen, as most addicts know, you need a plan. So let me introduce you to the idea of implementation plans. These are also known as if-then plans. They entail exactly what the title says. If a particular scenario happens, then what will you do? The goal here is to prepare ahead of time so you know what to do when you are faced with a temptation that could throw you off track. For example, if you find yourself wanting to go to the bar to have a few drinks, basically you'd have a pre-existing plan in place to do something else instead in order to interrupt that craving process. You might go for a run, work on a project, or call a friend or a recovery support person. And the more specific you can be, the better, as you'll begin to associate certain cravings with different, better behaviors that go along with it. You can think of it as trying to rewire your responses with new, healthier behaviors. If you aren't convinced, let me share with you the outcomes of a study that looked at the effectiveness of if-then plans. This particular study aimed to reduce stress in tennis players. It looked at the performance of players who didn't have a plan on how to reduce their stress versus those who did have a plan. The plan for the if-then planners was that if they felt stressed out, then they would do a breathing exercise, just a simple breathing exercise to calm down. The tennis players who had an implementation plan ended up actually being much less stressed out and much better able to regulate their stress than the no plan group, and they ended up performing much better during their matches. Ultimately, the goal of if-then plans is to create a link between a situation, which is the if, and the behaviors that should follow, the then. This will lead to the creation of new habits, and once the new habit has been practiced and established, you'll have new, healthy, automatic responses to situations that you previously dealt with in unhealthy ways. Something to keep in mind when you're creating an implementation plan is to stay realistic, meaning don't give yourself a then that is too difficult or that doesn't fit your personality, because ultimately you're less likely to do it. For example, if you don't like running, don't tell yourself that you'll go for a run if you get a craving. Instead, try something that fits better for you. Another thing I recommend is to keep it simple for two really good reasons. First, it's just going to be easier to remember. And second, it'll be easier to actually do. Things like breathing and mindfulness exercises, going for a walk, journaling, watching a motivational or entertaining video, are all things you can do without too much thinking or planning. I'd recommend writing down what your if-then goals are, what potential situations you may find yourself in that will require you to have a plan, and finally, implement the plan that will go along with these situations. Writing it out can not only help you organize your thoughts, but also provide you with a visual reference point if you ever end up needing it. It may be handy to keep this list on your phone or somewhere visible for quick access, particularly if you're overwhelmed. Let's take a moment and take a look at what might go on this list and what the list would end up looking like for you. What are the situations you'll need to deal with? The if. What are the goals and behaviors you will use? The then, when these situations come up. Something else that influences your motivation and goal pursuit is related to your belief system, mainly whether you believe in ability or in effort as it relates to your goal accomplishment. Believing in your ability means your successes are because of your innate ability to accomplish something. In other words, either you can do it or you can't do it. Period. By contrast, believing in effort means that you attribute success to working hard and staying consistent. If you believe in effort, you believe there's no predetermined answer for whether or not you'll accomplish your goal, but that success depends mostly on effort itself and on perseverance. Having a belief in ability makes you more susceptible to giving up when you experience a setback, while having a belief in effort makes you more likely to attribute failure to not having put in enough effort or time. And that makes you more likely to keep on trying. As I've mentioned previously, your interpretation of events and how you'll move forward depends on how you perceive things. With the right outlook, you'll be able to face challenges more effectively and more tenaciously. Adopting an effort-focused mindset will allow you to keep things in the way that will benefit you the most. Finally, I want to tell you about what's called the phenomenon of contagion when it comes to self-control. In this sense, contagion is actually a good thing because self-control is an important contributor to goal achievement. It can be kind of challenging to cultivate self-control at the beginning of your path to sobriety. Though with that said, I do have some pretty good news. Self-control is contagious both from other people and from yourself. Once you start exercising self-control in your life, you'll begin to notice that there's a ripple effect that starts to happen. Other behaviors that require self-control will get easier for you as well. And when you slip up, you can regain self-control contagion from also watching other people pursue their goals. And make sure that when you're getting a self-control boost from watching others, for instance, your recovery friends, you're doing exactly that. You're just watching. You want to avoid comparing yourself to the other person or feeling as though you are experiencing their self-control as your own. Instead, try to use it as fuel to inspire and motivate your own self-control in situations that matter to you. Getting yourself in a good mood and opening yourself up to being inspired by others will help you push the first domino that will set off your self-control contagion. So hopefully this video has given you some helpful tips and insights into how to stay motivated and pursue your goals effectively. Please remember to be patient with yourself. Changing your lifestyle is a big project that needs to be broken up into smaller, manageable pieces. The more self-awareness you gather and the more planning you do for the accomplishment of a new you, the more able you'll be to establish a strong recovery. Please, don't forget to keep things simple, reasonable, and positive.